When the police in Dinant, Belgium, picked up the receiver, the voice on the other end immediately stated that it was ready to name the location where Elodie, who had disappeared a few weeks ago, could be found. 1 minute later, the call was disconnected and a patrol immediately headed towards an old farm in the forests of the municipality of Houillet. The building was quickly found. The front door did not even have to be forced open. It was simply unlocked. After the police officers had inspected the empty rooms upstairs, they descended into the basement. There, they saw exactly what they had expected after the call. On the damp clay floor lay a small figure, covered with an old blanket. It was Elodie, whom the entire town had been searching for in vain for almost 1 month. The forensic technicians quickly confirmed that dehydration and hypothermia were the cause of the tragedy. Other causes or traces of intervention could not be determined. Everything looked as if Elodie had simply been brought here and left alone, without any attempt to cause her direct harm. The investigators had almost settled on the version of an unknown kidnapper when they noticed the drawings on the basement walls. Simple, even careless lines made with crayons showed ordinary children's motifs, but among them was one drawing that attracted special attention. It showed a figure with 2 faces and a short inscription, "Mommy gives me nothing to drink." Precisely this drawing was the reason why the investigation deviated from the original version of a kidnapping by a stranger and focused its attention on Elodie's immediate environment. It would turn out in the next few days that the police had been looking in the wrong direction from the very beginning. If you had been in the small town of Dinant in the autumn of 2003 and had asked any local about the most famous family, you would have received the same answer: Céline and her daughter, Elodie. Practically everyone in the town knew them. Photos of this family regularly appeared in local newspapers, and the articles always repeated the same story. Céline tried with all her might to cure her only daughter of a rare and mysterious illness. For the residents of Dinant, this story was well known and had long since become part of daily life. Neighbors told the investigators practically the same thing. They described Céline as an exemplary mother for whom her entire life revolved around Elodie. An elderly woman living opposite told the police that other mothers looked up to Céline and admired her patience and selflessness. In the eyes of others, Céline was a person who dedicated all her strength and time solely to helping her daughter. This impression was not only related to personal interaction, but also to reports in the press. In the newspapers of that time, there were many publications that told how Céline organized donations for Elodie's treatment. Almost every article was accompanied by a photo of Céline with a smile on her face and Elodie, who looked very fragile and lost. The townspeople who read these reports sincerely wanted to help and actively participated in charity events. Thanks to the publications, people had the clear impression that the family truly needed support. Moreover, Céline actively maintained her own blog in which she reported in detail on every new diagnosis and every doctor's visit. She described the symptoms of her daughter's illness in such detail that readers easily believed what was happening and empathized. Céline wrote how she had to overcome the indifference of doctors and bureaucratic difficulties to obtain the necessary examinations. The more often such publications appeared, the more people were touched by her story. When the police examined Elodie's medical records, the investigators had before them a huge archive full of contradictory diagnoses and unclear medical conclusions. The symptoms appeared suddenly, looked extremely serious, but quickly disappeared after admission to the hospital. The doctors could not find an exact explanation for what was happening to Elodie. However, no one asked additional questions, because even the thought that a mother could harm her own daughter seemed unrealistic. Céline herself gave the doctors the impression of a very demanding and caring person. She insisted on additional examinations, constantly sought new consultations, and even argued with doctors when their answers seemed insufficient to her. Such behavior convinced the medical professionals of the sincerity of her intentions. None of the doctors thought of doubting the veracity of Céline's words, so confident was her demeanor. When it became known that Elodie was no longer there, the townspeople immediately sided with the mother. Céline was perceived as a person who had gone through a tragedy and had lost what she lived for. At that moment, no one in Dinan suspected that behind the usual story, a completely different truth might be hidden. On the 12th of September, 2003, around 3:30 in the afternoon, the Dinan police received an urgent call from Céline. The woman informed the dispatcher that her daughter Elodie had disappeared from the public park on the bank of the Meuse River. According to Céline, she had kept Elodie constantly in sight, never letting her out of her sight. But literally in one moment, the girl had simply vanished. The woman's voice was agitated. The operator could barely understand the details of the report, but it became obvious. The situation was serious. The police quickly arrived at the park, cordoned off the area, and began checking the disappearance site. Several dozen people who were there at the time were immediately questioned. Witnesses told the police that they had noticed nothing unusual. People described that day as completely normal. Families were relaxing, children were running and playing near the playgrounds. No one noticed strangers or suspicious persons who might have attracted attention. During a more detailed questioning of eyewitnesses, the investigators found that Elodie was with her mother practically 1 minute before her disappearance. Witnesses confirmed that they had seen them together and had noticed nothing strange. Céline was in a state of severe emotional shock and could barely answer the police's questions during the first hours of the search. Her condition was described in the protocols as near panic. Law enforcement officers thoroughly examined the park area and adjacent territories. They inspected every children's playground, checked the bushes and the riverbank, illuminating every corner that could have provided even the slightest clue. But the inspection yielded no results. Neither objects nor traces were found that indicated the presence of a stranger or the removal of Elodie to another location. The recording of Céline's call to the police was later studied in detail by the investigators. Analyzing the call, it was noted that the woman's behavior and intonation seemed natural and convincing. This convinced the investigators that her story could be trusted. Neighbors and acquaintances who came to Céline that evening confirmed the woman's severe emotional state, her concern, and her despair over what had happened. By the end of the day, the investigation was at a dead end. After checking every testimony and examining the park area, the police found nothing that could explain Elodie's disappearance. Traces of a struggle or foreign intervention were not detected. It seemed as if the girl had disappeared on her own, without external causes and visible circumstances. And although the investigators had no clarity at that moment, they were soon to receive the first clue that could turn the course of the investigation in a completely unexpected direction. The last person to have seen Elodie that day was Céline's neighbor, an elderly man of 78 years. At first, his statements were not even included in the files. The police officers did not attach much importance to them, considering the elderly man's memories unreliable and confused. But later, as the situation became even more convoluted, the detectives decided to carefully re-examine every testimony. According to the interrogation protocol, the neighbor informed the police that he had seen Céline approximately at the same time Elodie, according to her words, had disappeared. He recounted that mother and daughter came out of the park together, holding hands. The elderly man could not immediately describe this scene in detail, but eventually added a very important detail that made the police officers think. He stated that Céline's face seemed unusual and even frightening to him. A record is preserved in the protocol in which the man says that her facial expression was evil, as he had never seen it before on Céline. On the margins of this interrogation, a brief note from a detective was later found, stating that the witness was elderly and there might have been confusion in his memories. However, the investigators still recorded these statements and decided not to definitively discard them. The information began to deviate from what other eyewitnesses had seen. And for the first time in the investigation, the possibility arose that not everything in Céline's own account was true. The police decided to take a closer look at the mother. Céline had not previously aroused any suspicion in them, but now the investigators were forced to check her statements more carefully. The detectives decided to thoroughly examine the woman's car, a family Peugeot, which was parked very close to the park that day. The first inspection of the car yielded no obvious evidence. There were no foreign objects in the interior, nothing unusual that could have attracted the attention of the police. But then one of the detectives noticed a strange detail. A small piece of paper lay on the floor between the front seats. It seemed as if someone had deliberately tried to hide it, pushing it under the seat so that it would not immediately catch the eye. When the paper was unfolded, it turned out to be a photo of Elodie, taken some years ago. On the back of the photo was a short, handwritten sentence, which the detectives immediately sent for graphological examination. This inscription worried the investigation. The person who wrote it claimed that Elodie should not have been born. At this stage, the investigators understood that the case was taking a completely unexpected turn. The hitherto impeccable image of the mother wavered in their eyes for the first time. Céline, who had been regarded with compassion and pity, might be hiding something. None of the police officers wanted to believe this, given her reputation and public image, but the fact remained a fact. The entire town was already convinced of Céline's absolute innocence, yet the police could not ignore the new circumstances and decided to check her statements more carefully. In the coming days, the investigators were to learn several more facts that would definitively change the direction of the investigation. After the photo appeared, the investigation abruptly changed direction. Just yesterday, Céline was considered an injured party, a woman who had gone through unimaginable things. But now the investigators began to look at her differently. The police's attention focused on the car, a grey Peugeot 206, which had been parked in the parking lot near Céline's house since Elodie's disappearance. During the re-inspection of the car, the detectives found not only the photo already found under the seat, but also a second photo hidden in the glove compartment. It showed Elodie very small in a hospital room with a bandaged arm. The photo looked old. The edges were worn. On the back of the photo, a short note had been made with a ballpoint pen. There was no date, no signature, or any explanations. Only a single sentence: "She should not have been born." The photo was immediately sent for expert analysis. The graphological report, which arrived a few days later, confirmed the investigators' suspicion. The handwriting belonged to Céline with a high probability. The laboratory staff identified characteristic features: the pressure, the strokes, the slant of the letters. Everything matched the samples the woman had left during interrogations and when filling out documents. This was the first direct evidence linking the mother to the events before Elodie's disappearance. The detectives could not explain why Céline had these photos in her car, let alone what the inscription on the back meant. The woman herself claimed never to have seen these pictures, and if she had written something on them, she could not recall the circumstances. The investigators recorded her words, but doubts had already solidified. When the expert materials were added to the main file, the attitude towards Céline finally changed. She was summoned for a new interrogation, which was also attended by representatives of the public prosecutor's office. Céline's behavior surprised the investigators. She was calm, composed, and answered questions without hesitation. However, her answers often contradicted the facts. For example, Céline claimed not to have used the car since Elodie's disappearance, although the expertise showed that the engine had been started at least 2 times since that day. Gradually, more and more small details accumulated in the case that did not fit the image of the flawless mother. Doctors from the clinic where Elodie had previously been treated recalled that Céline sometimes appeared without an appointment and demanded an urgent examination of her daughter. Neighbors noticed that Céline looked tired, irritable, and distant in the last few weeks before the disappearance. All this together made her behavior suspicious. When the investigators compared witness statements, expert reports, and the materials found, it became clear. Céline could have been not only an eyewitness, but a participant in the events. a new designation appeared in the files: Preliminary Suspect Number 1. This decision was made quietly, without public announcement. The public continued to consider Celine the victim of a tragedy, and the police understood that a direct accusation without sufficient evidence would provoke a wave of indignation. Nevertheless, the investigation had already reoriented internally. All new steps were now examined through the lens that Celine herself could be involved in Elodie's disappearance. A new phase of the investigation lay before them, checking medical data and making inquiries to clinics, which should confirm or refute this version. After the investigators received the first serious clue related to Celine, they decided to dig deeper. The detectives began to examine the financial documents related to the numerous fundraising campaigns for Elodie's treatment. These papers, which had previously raised no questions, now lay on the investigator's desk, revealing a completely different picture. The police officers checked bank statements, transfers, and accounts into which donations from townspeople and sympathetic people from other regions were received. Dozens of transfers were listed in the documents, and initially, everything looked completely normal. Amounts were regularly credited to the account, some of which immediately went to medical facilities and specialist consultations. However, gradually the police officers noticed another side of Celine's financial activity. Among the numerous records, strange expenses were found that in no way corresponded to the declared goals of the charity campaigns. The statements recorded purchases of expensive clothing in luxury stores, regular payments to elite restaurants, and even bills for trips to expensive hotels outside the city. It became obvious to the police that part of the money collected for treatment was spent for completely different purposes. The investigators decided to speak with Celine's ex-husband, who at that time lived separately and practically did not participate in family life. His statements shed additional light on the situation. The man explained to the police that he had left the family long before these events precisely because of financial issues. According to him, Celine constantly claimed that all the money was going towards examinations and medications for Elodie. But when he asked more specific questions, his wife's answers became evasive and then turned into conflicts. He told the investigators that for a long time he had tried to ignore these contradictions, as he believed his wife and saw her concern for their daughter. But gradually suspicions grew stronger. The bills for treatment increased, while Elodie's condition remained undefined and did not improve. Finally, he decided to leave, never having received clear answers from Celine to his questions about finances. After talking to the ex-husband, the police again examined the receipts and bank transfers. Now the detectives clearly saw that the situation, which had seemed absolutely transparent, showed signs of fraud. The money received to save Elodie was used for Celine's personal needs. No one in the town knew about this, and hardly anyone could have even suspected it. All this cast a completely different light on Celine's behavior and her true motives. At this stage of the investigation, the police for the first time had a clear suspicion about the motives of a possible crime. Celine might have become afraid that the truth about the misappropriation of funds would come to light. Perhaps Elodie had started to notice something or even say something that could reveal the truth. Thus, for the first time in the files, the version appeared that the girl had become an unwitting witness to her mother's financial schemes and posed a threat that could destroy the carefully constructed plan. Now the investigators had to gather evidence to confirm this version. Celine's behavior during another interrogation made the investigators doubt her sanity and her ability to comprehend what had happened. If the woman had previously maintained confidence and calmly answered the police's questions, this time, her reactions were completely different. According to the transcript of the third interrogation, the detective asked a simple and clear question about the events on the day of Elodie's disappearance. He asked Celine to reconstruct the chronology of her actions on the 12th of September, as detailed as possible. The answer recorded in the protocol surprised even experienced police officers. The woman remained silent for several minutes and then replied that she remembered nothing from that day. She used the word void to describe her own memories. According to the detectives who conducted the interrogation, her behavior was unusual and disturbing. The woman was often distracted, stared at one point, avoided eye contact, and periodically began to speak of herself in the third person. A sentence from Celine is recorded in the protocol, said with full conviction and firmness. Celine could not do that. The suspect said this as if referring to another person and not herself. The detectives tried to clarify why the woman spoke of herself in this way, but received no clear answer. On the contrary, after that, Celine withdrew into herself and refused to give explanations or continue the conversation on the merits. Furthermore, the psychologist's observation protocol records abrupt and inexplicable mood swings in the suspect. Celine could unexpectedly burst into tears and just a few minutes later become absolutely calm and even smile, as if nothing had happened. These behavioral moments immediately raised serious doubts in the investigation. The police understood that suspects usually behave differently. Either they consistently deny their involvement, or they confess their guilt and show clear emotions. But Celine fit none of the known behavioral patterns, which puzzled the detectives. After the interrogation was concluded, the investigators held an operational meeting. As a result, it was decided to involve forensic psychiatrists in the case to provide an objective assessment of Celine's mental state. The request from the police to the public prosecutor's office spoke of the necessity of a psychological psychiatric examination of the suspect, as her behavior during interrogations does not fit into the usual framework and raises concerns about her sanity and ability to give truthful statements. The investigators also referred to Celine's earlier medical records and doctor's visits, which had not been examined in detail before. The police's attention was drawn to the woman's regular consultations with psychologists and psychiatrists, whom she had visited in recent years. However, a precise diagnosis or a clear explanation for why these consultations took place was not found in the original documents. Thus, the investigation reached the stage where the simple search for a culprit became a much more complex task. Now, the detectives had to find out whether Celine could indeed have been unaware of her actions on the day of Elodie's disappearance. The next stage was to finally clarify what was really going on in the mind of the woman whom the entire town considered an ideal mother and a victim of circumstances. After Celine's psychiatric examination, the police received an expert opinion that completely changed the direction of the case. When the report lay on the investigators' table, it became clear that they were dealing with something far more complex than just a simple disappearance. The commission's expert opinion was unequivocal. Celine suffers from a rare mental disorder known as dissociative identity disorder. In simple words, this means that two completely different personalities coexisted in the woman's consciousness. The first personality, Celine herself, whom everyone in the town knew as caring, attentive, and emotionally stable. But alongside her, according to the doctors, another personality also existed, an alter ego that called itself Sophie. The medical report described in detail that the personality named Sophie completely dissociated itself from the main personality, Celine. This Sophie, the report stated, was aggressive, prone to conflict, tended to impulsive actions, and was hostile towards others. The most important thing the doctors emphasized was that during consultations, it was precisely the Sophie personality that categorically denied any emotional attachment or connection to Elodie and even expressed open aversion towards her. These words were recorded by the psychiatrists and shook even experienced investigators. The investigators had to admit that Celine's behavior during previous interrogations perfectly fit the diagnosis described by the doctors. The woman often lost herself in memories, used the third person when speaking of herself, and showed abrupt mood swings. All these signs fully corresponded to the conditions specified in the medical report. The psychiatrists also noted that personality shifts in such patients can occur suddenly and completely erase the memories of the previous personality regarding what it did or said. Precisely this circumstance could explain why Celine sincerely and convincingly claimed during interrogations not to remember anything about the events of the disappearance day. She could genuinely not remember if Sophie had control over her consciousness at that moment. After the doctor's report appeared for the first time in the entire investigation, a new suspect officially emerged in the case. Not a real, separate person, but an alternative personality within Céline herself. For the investigation, this was a completely unexpected turn. None of the police officers had ever encountered such cases before, and this significantly complicated the detectives' work. They were forced to completely rethink their previous versions and practically start the investigation from scratch. Taking into account this complex psychiatric aspect, now the police suspected that on the day of Elodie's disappearance, control over Céline's consciousness and behavior might have been entirely with Sophie. The alter ego could have acted according to its own motives and scenarios, which did not align with the conscious wishes of Céline herself. With this new information, the investigators decided to carefully examine past events and the woman's behavior in the days leading up to the disappearance. Thus, the case of a simple disappearance turned into a convoluted story about a person in whom two opposing personalities live. Now it was the police's task to understand exactly what Sophie had done that day and how this could explain Elodie's disappearance. The next stage of the investigation was to provide a definitive answer and shed light on the role of each personality in this complex and tragic story. After the version of personality splitting in Céline was officially confirmed by psychiatrists, the investigators again turned to the drawings found in the basement of the farmhouse. These pictures, which initially looked like simple child's scribbles, now drew the precise attention of the police, as they could shed light on the events before Elodie's disappearance. For their analysis, the investigators invited a child psychologist with extensive experience in similar situations. The specialist examined each drawing in detail and prepared an expert opinion that significantly changed the police's understanding of what had happened. According to her report, the drawings were clearly made by a person of very young age who had suffered severe psychological trauma. According to the expert, the strokes and the manner of drawing reflected the author's feeling of fear and helplessness. In the first drawing, the psychologist noticed the figure of an adult woman with two facial expressions simultaneously. One side looked benevolent and friendly, the other aggressive and frightening. The expert concluded that such a drawing indicates that the author was confronted with the unpredictable behavior of an adult, likely their own mother. This corresponded to the psychiatrist's conclusions about Céline's dual personality. The second drawing caused even greater concern for the psychologist. It depicted a small figure lying on the floor. Above it, an adult figure loomed with a glass of water in hand, and below the drawing, in large letters, was written, "Mommy gives me nothing to drink." The specialist emphasized that such images directly indicate serious and real abuse by an adult, who should have provided care and protection. In her opinion, the drawings could not simply be a product of fantasy. They reflected the author's real-life experience too accurately. The psychologist's expert opinion confirmed the investigation's fears and strengthened their conviction that Céline's alter ego, named Sophie, could indeed be involved in what happened. If the police had previously viewed this version with caution, there was now concrete confirmation of its reality. The image of Sophie ceased to be just an abstract idea of the psychiatrists and took on clearer and more terrifying features. These drawings became an important part of the case and convinced detectives to more closely examine the version of Sophie's involvement in Elodie's disappearance. Now the police suspected that it might have been this very personality who took Elodie to the basement and held her there. Investigators had to find out if Sophie's actions could be clearly separated from Céline's actions, and how to determine the degree of her personal responsibility for what happened. The next step was a deeper investigation into Céline's medical history and an attempt to find evidence confirming the alter ego's involvement in the key events of that day. When the version involving Céline's second personality became the primary one, investigators nevertheless decided to check other possible avenues as well. One such avenue was Céline's ex-husband, Elodie's father. In the initial stage of the investigation, he had attracted virtually no attention, but the police were obliged to rule out all doubts. The man was met again and questioned in detail about the events of the past several years. In his testimony, he stated that he had long tried to take Elodie to live with him, but had always met with resistance from Celine and the judicial authorities. He explained that he had appealed to the court several times to obtain full custody of his daughter, but the court had sided with the mother each time. According to the man, the judges believed Celine's stories about Elodie's severe illnesses and regular hospitalizations, and felt that only the mother could properly care for a girl with such a complex health condition. These statements attracted the attention of the investigators, as the ex-husband clearly indicated that he did not believe the diagnoses given to Elodie. In his words, he did not directly accuse his ex-wife, but pointed out that he saw something strange, unnatural, in her stories. He mentioned that many symptoms disappeared immediately once his daughter was admitted to the hospital. The man also told the police that he had repeatedly drawn doctors' attention to these circumstances, but no one believed him and regarded his complaints as attempts to harm his ex-wife and ruin her reputation. Despite the seriousness of his statements, the police were obliged to verify his possible involvement in Elodie's disappearance. The investigators requested confirmation of his alibi for the day of the disappearance. Celine's ex-husband provided documents confirming his departure abroad. The police had copies of plane tickets, border control stamps, and video footage from airport cameras confirming that the man was not even in Belgium on the day of the disappearance. After a detailed review of all the evidence presented, the investigators completely excluded Celine's ex-husband from the circle of suspects. His alibi proved to be unassailable, and the documents presented were recognized as genuine and credible. Nevertheless, his statements proved to be extremely useful for the investigation. In particular, they confirmed that he had expressed doubts about the reality of her illness long before Elodie's disappearance, and possibly was the first to notice the oddities in Celine's behavior. Thus, the man proved innocent, but his words further strengthened the version that Elodie's condition and numerous hospitalizations might have been deliberately induced. The ex-husband's testimony gave the police an additional motive to more closely examine Elodie's medical history and Celine's doctor visits. The detectives understood that the girl's medical history could hide far more dark details than they had assumed at the beginning of the investigation. The next step of the investigation was to finally clarify how the fabricated diagnoses, money, and the mother's split personality were connected. To understand Celine's complex history and grasp the reasons for her unusual condition, investigators turned to documents that had not previously appeared in the investigation. These papers related to a period of Celine's life of which almost none of her acquaintances knew anything. The police obtained the archives of the boarding school where the woman had spent several years of her childhood. According to the school psychologist's records, preserved since the early 1990s, Celine already showed serious emotional problems at that time. One of the psychologist's reports from 1990 stated that the girl was extremely withdrawn and practically did not communicate with anyone. She had no close friends, and contact with peers caused her significant difficulties. In the same document, the psychologist emphasized that Celine's emotional state had significantly worsened due to constant bullying by other students. It was also at that time that the appearance of an imaginary friend, whom Celine herself called Sophie, was first recorded. The school psychologist's report described in detail that the girl regularly talked about Sophie as if she were a close acquaintance who constantly protected her and was able to fight back against her tormentors. The psychologist noted that, in his opinion, the creation of an imaginary personality became a kind of psychological defense mechanism for Celine against the cruel treatment by peers. The school records confirmed that Celine was frequently harassed by classmates. She was repeatedly mocked and excluded from collective activities. Teachers and boarding school staff noticed her problems, but no serious measures were taken that could have helped her cope with the situation. Celine became more and more withdrawn, and her imaginary protector, Sophie, became her only salvation from the difficult and painful circumstances. Upon studying these archival materials, the investigators came to the realization that the dissociative identity disorder diagnosed in adult Celine by psychiatrists could have its roots precisely in this distant period of her life. It was then that the personality Sophie first appeared in the girl's consciousness to cope with constant psychological pressure and a feeling of helplessness. But with age and Celine's growing up, this personality did not disappear. On the contrary, it became stronger and developed further, manifesting itself more and more often and in more severe forms. In the Psychological Commission's protocols, investigators also found confirmation that Sophie was an aggressive and impulsive personality that emerged precisely in moments of emotional crises or stress. Such a personality fully corresponded to the description of Sophie already made in the school psychologist's documents. These facts confirmed the investigation's hypothesis that Céline's alter ego was not a coincidence or a simple invention. It was the result of severe trauma suffered in childhood. But even despite understanding the nature of this second personality, this did not absolve Céline of her responsibility. The police understood very well that they were dealing with a person with a severe mental disorder, but the investigation had to continue, taking into account all new details. The alter ego. Sophie, although it had emerged many years ago as a defense mechanism, was now perceived as a full participant in the crime. Thus, the documents from the school archives provided the investigation with important information about the origin and development of Céline's psychological problems. Now the police could better understand the suspect's motivation and behavior. The next step was a detailed examination of medical documents and consultations with doctors who had observed Céline in adulthood. It was precisely these data that should show how deeply her second personality had taken root in the woman's consciousness, and whether Sophie could make autonomous and independent decisions at the time of Elodie's disappearance. When the police decided to organize a therapeutic session in the presence of a detective, no one was convinced of its effectiveness. The psychiatrist invited to talk with Céline specialized in such complex cases and warned in advance that communication with Sophie might be possible, but unpredictable. During the meeting in the office, an investigator was also present, recording every action of the suspect. Initially, Céline was calm and seemed indifferent. But after the first questions from the psychiatrist, her behavior completely changed. The woman's voice became rougher, her gaze cold, her gestures sharp and confident. The psychiatrist immediately made the investigator understand that they were now facing not Céline, but her second personality, Sophie. The conversation proceeded cautiously. The psychiatrist avoided direct accusations and asked questions about Elodie's whereabouts neutrally and calmly. Sophie's answer sounded confident and without hesitation. She briefly explained that Elodie was now where nothing threatened her. The investigator noted in the protocol that the suspect's voice sounded ironic, as if she was deliberately playing with the police. The psychiatrist gently continued the conversation, trying to obtain more precise information from Sophie. He inquired about her actions on the day of Elodie's disappearance, but she answered evasively. To the question of what exactly happened, Sophie only repeated that she had hidden Elodie so that she would be safe. She spoke coldly, without emotions, and absolutely convinced of her righteousness. The atmosphere became increasingly tense. Sophie demonstrated her superiority over Céline more and more with each question, calling her weak and incapable of making necessary decisions. According to Sophie, she was forced to intervene, as otherwise the situation could have ended much worse. The psychiatrist tried to find out details but only met with categorical silence. At a certain point, the psychiatrist took out a map and suggested that Sophie show the location where Elodie was. She looked at the map for several seconds, assessing, and then calmly pointed to a spot outside the city near a forest, where an old, abandoned house was located. The investigators understood the significance of this gesture very well. Formerly, Sophie had made no direct statements and had not confessed her guilt. However, her reference to a specific location practically amounted to a confession. The police were aware that most likely the missing Elodie would be found there. After that, the conversation ended. The psychiatrist noted that the suspect's personality returned to Céline, who at that moment looked lost and could not remember anything that had just been discussed. These observations were recorded in detail and became part of the evidence confirming the psychiatrist's diagnosis. Now the investigation faced a new task: It was necessary to verify Sophie's words and inspect the location she indicated. The police understood that the result of this verification could finally confirm the involvement of Celine's alter ego in what happened. Even 1 year after the case was formally closed, Detective Luke continued to be tormented by doubts. He constantly remembered the session in which Celine's alter ego, Sophie, had indicated the location where Elodie was found. At that time, everything seemed obvious to the investigators, and no one was bothered that some details did not fit into the final version. One such detail particularly bothered Luke. On evening, he again pulled out the old files and spread them out on the table in front of him. Before him lay 2 photos that seemingly could have nothing to do with each other. The first photo was taken at a charity event about 1 month before the day Elodie disappeared. It showed a smiling Celine greeting guests. Her earrings were clearly visible in the picture, large pearls that she often wore at public events. The second was a drawing found in the basement of the abandoned house. In this drawing, a female figure was depicted with a child's hand, labeled by the author as Evil Mommy. And on the ears of this figure were drawn exactly the same pearl earrings. Luke had noticed this during the first review of the materials, but at that time had not attached much importance to it. Now, however, he carefully read the inventory list of Celine's personal belongings, which had been drawn up on the day of the disappearance. The document was clear and left no doubt. The pearl earrings were at home, in a jewelry box, and on that day, the woman had not worn them. This was strange. If on the day of the disappearance, Celine's consciousness was controlled by the personality Sophie, and she was not wearing earrings, how could Elodie have drawn them in the basement? This detail completely contradicted the official version of the investigation and the medical opinion. Luke understood that the drawing could not have been made on that day. Most likely, Elodie had drawn from memory. This meant she had not depicted the events of the day of disappearance, but what happened regularly and repeatedly. And the drawings did not depict Sophie, but Celine herself, the woman whom the whole city considered a caring mother. The detective looked at the other drawings and notes again. It became obvious that the girl had long tried to tell what she had to go through in normal life. Sophie might have been only part of the picture, but the main source of the threat had apparently always been the same. This small detail, these earrings, allowed Luke to look at the case completely differently. Now he was sure that the archives contained not just a story about a mental disorder, but something much more terrible. The real culprit had remained unpunished all this time, and Luke was faced with the task of convincing his colleagues again that the truth was far more complicated than the official opinion. After Luke found the contradiction with the earrings, he understood. He had to look for confirmation in the documents that could shed light on everything that happened before Elodie's disappearance. He sent an official request to the hospital archive, requesting her complete medical history for all years of observation. Several weeks later, several folders with dozens of reports, analyses, and opinions were delivered to his office. Luke began to compare the data of Elodie's hospitalizations with a calendar where Celine's work shifts and vacations were noted. The picture came together frighteningly quickly. Every case of Elodie's worsening condition coincided with the days when her mother was nearby, at home or on vacation. As soon as the girl was admitted to the hospital and remained under the supervision of staff, her condition rapidly stabilized. After discharge and returning home, the seizures recurred. Luke created a chronological table and sent it to an independent pediatrician not associated with the city of Dinant. The doctor examined the materials and issued an official opinion. The symptoms described in the reports did not correspond to any registered diseases. Their appearance and disappearance depended directly on the mother's actions. According to the expert, all signs pointed to Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a rare disorder in which a caregiver deliberately causes or feigns illness symptoms in a loved one to gain sympathy and attention from others. For Luke, that was the final point. All the details that had previously not fit together finally made sense. Elodie lived for years in a state of constant threat, and the illnesses for which the whole city pitied her were artificially provoked. Céline was not saving, but slowly destroying her own daughter's health, turning her suffering into a tool for gaining pity and admiration. Now it became clear that Sophie was not a murderer. She was the part of Céline's consciousness that tried to stop what was happening. The kidnapping of Elodie was not a crime. It was a desperate attempt at protection. Sophie had hidden the girl in the abandoned house to save her from her mother. But the control did not last long, and when Céline regained consciousness, it was already too late. For the investigation, this discovery was a real shock. All versions established 1 year ago fell apart. The true criminal was not the alter ego, but Céline herself, the one whom the whole city considered an example of maternal love. It was time to fully reconstruct the chronology of events from September 12, 2003. The day everything went differently than initially assumed at the beginning of the investigation. Thanks to the new data that Detective Luke had found, one can now imagine step by step, literally minute by minute, what exactly happened between Céline and Elodie then. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Céline was at her home. To the outside world, it was an absolutely ordinary day, no different from dozens of others. But within the family, everything was different. At that time, Céline was preparing another dose of a medication that, according to the official version, was supposed to alleviate Elodie's condition. In reality, it was something that led to a worsening of the girl's well-being and exacerbated the symptoms that caused everyone around them to sympathize with the mother and admire her incredible steadfastness. This time, however, events began to unfold according to a completely different scenario. Around 2:30, Céline was in a state of strong emotional tension, and precisely then, her consciousness switched to another personality. That was the moment when Sophie, who had long slumbered in the depths of the woman's consciousness, took control of the situation. She was clearly aware of what Céline was planning, and fully understood that there was no time for reflection. For the first time in a long time, the alter ego Sophie had the opportunity to act unhindered. Precisely at 14:45, Sophie, acting quickly and decisively, arrived at the city park where Céline had previously left Elodie under the supervision of other adults. An elderly neighbor nearby, observing what was happening, noticed that Céline's face looked extremely tense and even frightening, but he naturally could not have guessed that he was facing not Céline herself, but her second personality, who was trying to save the girl. At that moment, Sophie thought neither of witnesses nor of consequences. Her only goal was to quickly remove Elodie from Céline's influence and take her to where no one could harm her. The girl trusted her mother and, of course, calmly followed her, without understanding that something extraordinary was happening. Just half an hour later, around 15:15, Sophie took Elodie to an old farmhouse, abandoned and practically forgotten by people. She knew this house from her childhood, and it seemed to her that this place would be the ideal hiding place where Céline would never suspect to look for her daughter. In the house, Sophie left a supply of food, several bottles of water, and warm clothes. She was in a hurry, nervous, and had not thought through her plan to the end, believing that someone would soon find Elodie and protect her better than she herself could. At 15:25, Sophie, convinced she had done everything possible to bring the girl to safety, returned to the city. She tried to behave naturally, to do everything so that no one suspected anything. But only a few minutes later, what Sophie could not have foreseen and avoided happened. Her control abruptly disappeared. Consciousness returned to Céline, who awoke completely confused and did not understand what had just happened. Alone in the car, she panicked when she noticed that Elodie was nowhere to be seen. Exactly at 15:30, Céline, in complete panic over what had happened, dialed the emergency services number and reported her daughter's disappearance. Her voice sounded sincere and convincing, and the police did not doubt the truthfulness of her words. At that time, no one could imagine that the true scenario of this day was far more complicated and terrible than it initially seemed. The tragedy was that the rescue attempt made by Sophie was unsuccessful and even fatal. Due to a lack of experience, time, and insufficient preparation for such a step, Sophie could not provide long-term protection for Elodie. She acted impulsively, guided only by the desire to help the girl escape another threat from her mother. But due to the abrupt personality change and the inability to maintain control for long, she only worsened the situation. Thus it finally became clear that Elodie's kidnapping was not evil intent or a conscious crime. It was a desperate and clumsy attempt at rescue from a person whom the whole city considered an example of love and care. Sophie was not the culprit of the tragedy, but rather its indirect victim, trapped in Celine's complex mental illness. Luc faced the task of ensuring that this new truth was heard and accepted by his colleagues, despite all the complexity and painfulness of such a version of events. In June 2004, even before Luc began to review the files in detail, the court in Dinant made a final decision in this case. At that time, no one could even imagine how flawed this judgment would turn out to be. The judge read out the decision, which was based on the results of the psychiatric expertise, according to which Celine was deemed incapable of recognizing the consequences of her actions. In the official verdict, the words were spoken that later became crucial and final. The accused is found not guilty due to insanity at the time of the act. This was followed by the usual verdict for such cases. Celine was sentenced to compulsory admission to a closed psychiatric institution without the right to leave it at her own will. At that time, this verdict seemed fair and logical to everyone: the court, the police, and the citizens of the city. The judge relied on the medical opinions, which at that time were recognized as the only possible and correct version of events. Legally, everything was impeccably regulated, and no one saw a reason to doubt the correctness of the decision made. However, precisely this legal impeccability of the judgment later became an insurmountable obstacle when Detective Luc found new evidence that completely refuted the original version of the investigation. Luc presented all the data he had collected to the prosecutor's office, hoping for a reopening of the case. In response, however, he received an unambiguous legal opinion. The principle of non bis in idem, one of the most important in Belgian law, prohibits prosecuting a person again for the same crime if a verdict has already been rendered and has entered into force. This meant that no matter how convincing and irrefutable Luc's investigations were, it was legally impossible to change the outcome of the case. Even with absolutely clear evidence that Celine had committed cruel acts against Elodie, the court could not re-examine her guilt and certainly could not render a new judgment. Thus, despite all efforts and the thoroughness of Luc's investigations, it was officially impossible to declare Celine guilty. The justice system was trapped in its own laws, and the woman, who for a long time was considered by everyone as an example of love and self-sacrifice, never received punishment for what she had done to her daughter all those years. Luc understood that this was a real legal tragedy that would remain forever in the police archives. Only a few months after Luc received the official rejection of a reopening of the case, he made a decision that was the logical outcome of this whole story. In early 2005, on the desk of the police chief of Dinant lay a letter of resignation from Detective Luc at his own request. Colleagues, of course, knew why he was leaving, although no one spoke openly about it. Luc simply could not come to terms with the fact that a person whose guilt was obvious escaped responsibility thanks to a formal legal technicality. Years later, in 2015, a new, so far last, entry appeared in Celine's medical file, made by a psychiatrist in the closed sanatorium. The entry was short, but contained information that put an end to her personal history. It stated, "Patient is stable. The personality Celine no longer manifests. The personality Sophie dominates. To questions about the past, she categorically refuses to answer." Formerly, Celine continued to be under medical supervision. Factually, the personality that the residents of Dinant knew and about whom so much was spoken in court no longer existed. Her place was completely taken by Sophie, the one who had once tried to stop the crime. Céline had disappeared forever, hidden behind a diagnosis that became a convenient excuse, thereby finally evading responsibility for her actions. As for Luc, after leaving the police force, he never touched this story again and made no comments about it. In a sense, he had lost. The system did not allow him to achieve real justice, and the one who had done terrible things remained unpunished. Luc chose personal peace, gave up the senseless struggle, and decided that he could live on, at least with the knowledge of having done everything possible. Thus, the whole truth about what happened to Elodie is now fully revealed. It is known that Céline tormented her daughter for years for her own attention, and that the alter ego, Sophie, made an unsuccessful attempt to save Elodie from further suffering. But despite all the obviousness of this tragedy, one important moment remained unknown. Was Céline's memory loss a real psychological phenomenon, or did she deliberately stage the final act in her play to forever get rid of the witness to her crimes? That remained a mystery in the files, forever hidden under the seal of secrecy. Sometimes, emotions overwhelm a person so much that it becomes almost impossible to deal with them. Sometimes this inability to control emotions leads to irrevocable consequences. The story we are about to tell is reminiscent of the parable of the butterfly flying into a candle flame. Christina Robinson was born on the 19th of August, 1989, in the American city of South Bend, Indiana. She was the first of 5 children in the family. Later, 2 more sisters and 2 brothers joined them. Christina's young mother was only at the beginning of her life's journey when she gave birth to her daughter. From an early age, Christina, growing up in a large family, dreamed of her own happy marriage and several children. But the family idyll in her parents' home broke down. Problems began when she was very young, and eventually her father left the family. Striving not to repeat her parents' fate, Christina dreamed of a stable family. However, during her school years, her life drastically changed after meeting an older boy. When she learned of her pregnancy, despite her young age, she decided to become a mother. Unfortunately, Christina's chosen one proved irresponsible and left her alone with the baby. The story seemed to repeat the fate of her mother, who was also left alone with the children after her husband left. Christina saw how her mother completely devoted herself to raising the children, sacrificing her personal happiness. Despite her young age, Christina took her goals and dreams seriously. She understood that only hard work would help her achieve them. It was especially important for her to be a good mother, and according to those around her, she succeeded, even though motherhood came to her early. In her last school years, Christina met Troy, who was significantly older than her. He worked in a shop near her house. Christina herself took the initiative to get acquainted, as she had always been attracted to more mature men, although Troy was twice her age. Despite the significant age difference and her mother's warnings, a relationship developed between them. On the 14th of November 2007, shortly after Christina came of age, they married. 1 year later, Christina was expecting a child. But on the 21st of April 2009, misfortune struck the family. Lilian could not overcome congenital complications. In this difficult time, Christina sought support from her husband, but without success. Troy was a reserved, even cold person with conservative views on life. He rarely showed emotions. Over time, the family had 4 children: Haley, Sierra, Kira, and Anthony. People around them described Christina as a bright, kind person. Her maternal care was evident in everything concerning the children. Troy, on the other hand, tried to keep everything under his control, which caused resistance from his young wife. Troy sought a life partner who would dedicate herself to the home and household. Christina, however, still very young, dreamed of something else. She was only at the beginning of her journey and was trying to find herself in this world. The young woman wanted to spend time with friends, enjoy gatherings, and be independent of others' decisions. Her husband, however, wanted to limit her world to domestic duties. This lifestyle of his young wife increasingly caused him discontent. The tension in their relationship grew. Troy constantly nagged about trifles, allowing himself rude remarks and accusations. After a series of unpleasant events, one of their nightly arguments, which arose without any particular reason, escalated into a serious conflict. For the first time in their marriage, Troy became violent towards Christina. She did not remain silent and contacted law enforcement. To the arriving patrol officers, the man tried to present the situation in a light favorable to him. But the marks on Christina's face spoke for themselves. Troy was taken to the station, and his wife decided it was time to change her life and end this marriage. However, when her husband was released, this only intensified their confrontation. After the separation, Troy behaved strangely. He tried to track his ex-wife, and during accidental encounters in the city, he acted aggressively. This forced Christina to seek a restraining order from the court. But even after receiving the document, the man continued to disregard the imposed restrictions. He was arrested several times, but it had no serious consequences. In the autumn of 2017, Christina was diagnosed with a serious illness. Fortunately, the diagnosis was made in time, and treatment was able to help. After the operation, the young mother was recovering at home. During this time, Troy began to show insistent interest in Christina again. He tried to restore the relationship and bring the family back together, but she made it clear that she only saw him as the father of her children. Christina had nothing against him interacting with the little ones, but did not want to return to their former relationship. While Christina was recovering at home from the operation, she often received visits from family and friends. Her mother, as well as her two best friends, Gina and Brooke, regularly came over. Brooke usually came with her husband, Daniel. She and Christina had known each other since early years and had practically grown up together. During this time, a strong friendship developed between them, more akin to a familial relationship. That evening, Christina's mother came to check on her daughter and stay overnight. When she entered the house, she surprisingly discovered Daniel there. Initially, this did not arouse particular suspicion. He often visited her together with his wife. Perhaps he had just stopped by to drop something off from his spouse. However, the situation became increasingly unusual. His wife Brooke was not there, and Daniel himself made no move to leave. Not even when the woman offered to take care of Christina herself. Moreover, he stayed until morning, which was already completely beyond the scope of a normal visit. The next day, Christina's mother coincidentally met a close friend of Brooke's. Concerned about the situation, she asked why Brooke's husband would come alone to Christina's and stay overnight. The interlocutor was stunned. She heard about it for the first time. It turned out that Brooke had long suspected her husband of infidelity, but had never suspected that he was spending time with her best friend. Betrayed by two close people at once, her husband and her childhood friend, Brooke immediately set off to Christina for a serious conversation. In conversation with a friend, Christina revealed an unexpected secret. For the last 10 years, she had secretly been meeting with Daniel, the husband of her best friend Brooke. Furthermore, she did not plan to end this relationship. This confession caused great outrage in Brooke. News of the situation quickly reached Christina's ex-husband Troy. Learning that his wife had been unfaithful to him during their marriage, he decided to use this fact to his advantage. Troy initiated proceedings for full custody of their children, formally citing concern for their welfare. The people around him, however, understood. His main goal was to harm his ex-wife. Despite all the scandals and revealed secrets, the connection between Christina and Daniel did not break. Since early 2018, a strange situation developed. Daniel lived alternately with Brooke and Christina. His behavior followed a clear pattern. He went to one when he argued with the other. Both women knew about this, but accepted the situation. No one wanted to break this cycle first. Of course, this led to new conflicts. The former friends were constantly arguing, sometimes resorting to physical altercations. In May 2018, during another meeting, Christina emphatically asked Daniel to leave Brooke for good. By this time, such conversations began to cause him clear annoyance. A serious conflict erupted between them, leading to unpleasant consequences. Christina had to be hospitalized with a concussion. Despite this incident, she continued to hope for a future with her friend's husband. This complicated situation ultimately led to tragic events. During this time, Christina maintained contact with her ex-husband Troy, who sought full custody of their joint children. She tried to de-escalate the situation, and it seemed as if her ex-husband was behaving more reasonably. In early June 2018, they took a family trip to the amusement park. Against the backdrop of difficulties in her relationship with Daniel and her best friend, contact with Troy significantly improved, although he continued to try to change the custody arrangement. Christina was glad for the opportunity to distract herself from the difficult situation with Daniel by spending time with the children and focusing on their upbringing. On the 9th of June 2018, Christina went to an important job interview. She greatly hoped to get this position to improve her financial situation. Until then, she had been largely dependent on the support of her ex-husband and relatives and understood that this situation could not last forever. She wanted to achieve independence, build a career, and secure a stable future for herself and her children. After the interview, Christina joyfully informed her mother by phone that she had gotten the job. She was on her way and promised to call back later when she arrived home. That day, our protagonist planned to celebrate an important event, her new job. She wanted to meet with her mother and sister, who lived only 15 to 20 minutes away. Her mother eagerly awaited this meeting, but after 1 hour, Christina still hadn't called. Initially, her mother tried not to worry, thinking her daughter was simply busy and had forgotten the appointment, although that was not like her at all. When she called herself, she was disturbed to find that Christina's phone remained silent. Next, she tried sending messages, both regular and through various messengers, but there was no reply. The entire day passed with unsuccessful attempts to make contact. In the evening, unable to bear the uncertainty any longer, her mother contacted law enforcement. However, at the police station, she received a disheartening response. Not enough time had passed to file a missing person report. She was reminded that Christina was an independent adult who did not need to be constantly reachable. She was advised to wait for 24 hours. The worried mother drove to her daughter's house hoping to find her there, but the apartment looked untouched, as if Christina had never returned. The little ones were with their father Troy at that time. Despite growing concern, the woman had to wait until the next day, hoping that everything would clear up. The next day, when she again failed to reach her daughter, the mother contacted law enforcement. This time, the report was taken without unnecessary questions. The situation caused great concern. A responsible woman who raised 4 children, was always reachable and cared for her little ones had disappeared. Something like this had never happened before, which greatly worried the mother. This behavior was not at all typical for Christina, especially given her imminent return to work and an important appointment in the coming days. Most alarmingly, a court hearing on child custody was scheduled for the 12th of June 2018. But Christina did not show up. Her mother came to the hearing hoping to see her daughter there, but only met Troy, who also knew nothing of the situation and seemed confused. This news finally unsettled the woman. She was convinced that her daughter would never miss such an important event. Christina planned to retain custody of the children, but her absence from the hearing could change everything. On the same day, her stepfather received an unusual message from Christina. She wrote about some problems and asked for help, pleading to be picked up somewhere. The stepfather shared the information he received with Christina's mother. She was disturbed and waited for further instructions. After 2 hours, however, the stepfather received a new message, assuring him that everything was fine, with a request not to worry her mother. This strange behavior finally convinced the relatives that something terrible had happened to Christina. At this time, the authorities were already conducting intensive searches and hoped to see her at the court hearing. No traces of the missing person could be found. The police began to more closely examine Christina's complicated life story and relationships. Initially, the ex-husband was at the top of the list of suspects. They were connected by a long series of conflicts, including custody disputes and various unpleasant incidents. The man had reasons to wish for his ex-wife's disappearance. However, it was he who actively helped the investigation, unlike others. The former friend Brooke and her husband Daniel showed no interest in searching for Christina. This couple also aroused serious suspicions among the police. Ultimately, Troy's innocence was confirmed. Several people testified that he was in public with the children at the time of Christina's disappearance. Moreover, his concern for his ex-wife seemed genuine. Despite all disagreements, Troy did not want the children to grow up without maternal care. Christina continued to try to attract Daniel's attention, despite his relationship with Brooke. Both made her understand that her persistence was unwelcome. Daniel Lynn's family owned a country house in St. Louis County, Minnesota. Checking cell phone data showed that the last signal from Christina's phone was located there. It was noteworthy that the property was a sprawling area that had been vacant for the last 5 years. The owners only occasionally stopped by to maintain minimal order. Investigators decided to search this location for traces of Christina's presence. From the outside, the house looked like a typical abandoned building, but when law enforcement looked inside, they made some unsettling discoveries. Although according to Daniel's family, no one had lived there for a long time, a distinct smell of household chemicals, obviously recently used, was noticeable through the ajar window. In the kitchen, protective gloves for handling aggressive substances were found. Residents reported unusual activities around the vacant house. From the 11th to the 15th of June, several cars were seen there. The investigation of Daniel's recent bank transactions revealed the purchase of a large quantity of cleaning supplies and protective equipment, similar to those found in the house. The police requested surveillance footage from the hardware store where these purchases were made. That day, a couple of customers, a man and Brooke, were noticed in the store. Witnesses noted their unusual behavior. The salesperson who served these visitors shared his observations. According to him, the woman seemed particularly worried. Brooke's gaze constantly darted around. She was clearly in great agitation. At the end of June 2018, almost 3 weeks after Christina's disappearance, the police finally received permission to search Daniel's family's vacant house. Inside the building, investigators found no significant clues. The room had been thoroughly cleaned with detergents. However, a fire pit was discovered in the yard where interesting items were found. Among the burned items were parts of a cell phone, a bracelet, components of jeans, and other melted objects. Special attention was drawn to a coin from the amusement park with a corresponding inscription. It was precisely at this place that Christina had spent time with her former husband and relatives shortly before her disappearance. This information was confirmed by Troy. On the evening of the 2nd of July 2018, 24 days after the disappearance, the police completed the thorough investigation of the house and surrounding area. Investigators carefully examined every corner of the property. At some distance from the fire pit, a strange area of disturbed earth was noticed. Upon closer examination, it turned out to be a prepared depression. There, Christina was found, wrapped in a blanket and tied in an unusual position with ropes. Investigators suspected that this position was chosen to save space and avoid unnecessary attention. The examination showed several injuries, including characteristic pressure marks in the neck area. Everything indicated that what happened was caused by human hands. Experts determined that Christina had spent some time in a difficult situation and had sustained serious injuries. As the main cause of the incident, experts cited pressure in the neck area. Following these findings, investigators applied for an arrest warrant for 40-year-old Daniel Lean. However, the man decided to flee, and his whereabouts remained unknown. The police also tried to find Brooke, but it turned out that she had also disappeared. In the evening, an anonymous tip was received at the police station that Daniel had gone to a trailer park several hundred kilometers from his home. The investigation had information that the main person might be connected to the disappearance of their acquaintance. Daniel himself had hinted at it after her disappearance. Officers drove to the specified location, but by that time the wanted individuals had already left. Witnesses were found who confirmed their recent presence. Locals pointed to a trailer where the couple had stayed. In the trash can, investigators found a receipt from a nearby gas station. Upon reviewing surveillance footage, they noticed Brooke and Daniel entering the store together. They were holding hands, which clearly indicated Brooke's voluntary presence with her husband and not coercion. On the 3rd of July 2018, Brooke unexpectedly appeared. She was immediately taken to the police station. According to her statements, Daniel had called her on the night of Christina's disappearance. He asked her to bring tools and some things from home, explaining that the basement on the family property was flooded and needed urgent repair. Brooke said that upon her arrival with the requested items, she found Christina there. She admitted that a conflict had arisen, which escalated into a serious argument. According to her, she stayed out of what happened. In a fit of rage, Daniel committed an ill-considered act, after which Christina showed no signs of life. Then the man led his wife outside, took garden tools, and went back into the building. Brooke waited in the car for her husband. His absence dragged on unusually long. When her husband returned home, he seemed out of breath and was completely dirty. Brooke denied any involvement in the incident. She said she had nothing to do with her rival's disappearance, but was convinced that Daniel had hidden Christina somewhere on his property. She could not name the exact location and insisted that she was not involved in the incident at all and had seen nothing. According to Brooke, she had not met Daniel again and did not know his whereabouts. The investigators did not reveal that they had already found traces of Christina's presence. They simply listened and tried to find inconsistencies in the suspect's statements. But there were few contradictions. After the conversation, she was released with a request to report if any new information about her missing friend emerged. It seemed as if Brooke was believed and no longer suspected. However, she continued to be observed, and her frequent visits to a trailer park where her parents owned a small house were noted. Although Brooke claimed not to know Daniel's whereabouts, gas station cameras showed them together. This indicated that they had left the city together, even if they may have separated later. Investigators decided to verify the suspect's statements. When Brooke came to the trailer park again, she was already expected. Investigators entered the trailer right after her and found Daniel there. Both immediately demanded a lawyer and refused to speak with the police. They were arrested without incident. Brooke's possible role in this story attracted particular attention from the investigators. Experts found Daniel's DNA material, but this did not prove his sole involvement in the incident. There was a possibility that his wife was involved in the incident and the subsequent disposal of evidence. The crime scene had been so thoroughly cleaned that it was impossible to find any evidence. According to Brooke's account, Christina and Daniel had a complicated relationship. Although he often became aggressive, she continued contact with him due to her deep affection. Christina spoke about this several times with her relatives. Strong feelings prevented her from ending this relationship. After gaining financial independence, Christina hoped to soon resolve the problems with her husband and rekindle the connection with Daniel. Unfortunately, these plans were not successful. The outcome was tragic. Both spouses were interrogated, but without success. Brooke claimed Christina had provoked the conflict herself. As before, the husband could not control his emotions, and Daniel refused to cooperate with investigators. His defense lawyer believed the prosecution did not have sufficient evidence. However, this assessment proved incorrect. The motive for the incident remained unclear. Christina's former close friend continued to deny her involvement. Daniel, who was over 40, could not raise the $1 million bail and remained in custody. The investigators did not have sufficient grounds for a more serious charge, so they offered him cooperation. Finally, Daniel agreed to a lesser charge, for which a maximum of 40 years could be imposed. After the deal with the judiciary, he received 16 years in prison. His acquaintance Brooke admitted that she helped to remove traces of the incident, which also helped to avoid a lengthy trial. To the astonishment of Christina's mother and everyone following the case, Brooke received only 1 year. Essentially, she confessed that she was near her best friend during the incident but did not intervene. However, the prosecution had no solid evidence to prove her direct involvement. After her release, she remained in contact with Daniel. Christina's relatives were outraged. Even her former husband Troy spoke out against this lenient sentence, but attempts to review the court decision were unsuccessful. The relatives had to accept the situation, although 4 children were left without a mother. The eldest, Haley, stayed with her maternal grandmother. The other 3 moved in with their father. In an interview with journalists, Christina's mother said she wanted her daughter to be remembered not as a participant in a sad incident, but as a wonderful mother, daughter, and sister. She tried for a long time to obtain a harsher punishment for the culprits, but without success.